One of the oldest known openings is called the Giuoco piano, or the Italian game, and it's characterized by pawn to e4, pawn to e5, knight to f3, attacking the pawn, knight to c6, defending the pawn, bishop to c4, developing the bishop in preparation for castling and also eyeing this f7 pawn. And the bishop follows with bishop to c5. And this is the setup. From here, there are various ways that white can continue to play. The main line continues with pawn to c3. White's preparing to advance the pawn to d4 and build up a strong center. So black has to be aware of this and try to counter that in some way. You can't have it all, so you usually give up time for space or force and battle it out with those imbalances. So let's look at a game played in the 1800s and see how the Giuoco piano can play out in their strategies here. So this is an old game, and so black develops his knight to f6, and he's attacking this pawn. So he's kind of preventing this pawn push right away, otherwise he'll lose a pawn. So that pawn's undefended. He needs to decide what to do, and he defends it with the pawn, and black develops this pawn, defends this pawn, and opens up this line for the bishop. The bishop develops here to e3. Now generally you don't want to double your pawns, but you know there are exceptions to everything in chess, and after you've played some variations and lines a number of times, you can see what you can get away with, and sometimes it's advantageous actually to create to do some violation, to commit some violation in general principle for some other gain. And that's the case here, because if he takes and he takes, then this file becomes open, as we'll see. Bishop backs off. He doesn't want to give him the double pawns over here. The knight develops. Bishop develops, attacking this bishop. They're all defended here, though. The queen slides up. The queen slides up, and now black is free to castle on either side. You know, my analysis isn't going to go too deep, and only on the surface here we'll look at some of the basic reasons for the moves. The bishop comes here pinning the knight, so the knight moves, the bishop will capture the queen. Pawn attacks the bishop, says, what are you going to do? He backs off, and now the bishop takes the bishop, and the pawn takes, because white really wants this open file for his rook after they castle. Black castles, and now white gets that pawn to d4 move after all, and develops a very strong center, which will give his pieces a little more mobility than black's. And black attacks the bishop, the little guy. Bishop runs. Bishop pins the knight, and white castles. Now the rook slides over in preparation for some pressure maybe on this pawn after all is said and done. So white has a rook here on this A file, and he wants to open it up. He wants to make that rook useful. And it's not doesn't have any scope as long as its own pawn is in its way. And that's one way that you do this. You try to break up pawns and open up files and lines for your pieces. All else being equal. Yeah, it's a hierarchy of importance. The knight swings over, try and maneuver over to the king side. Pawn takes, and he's accomplished the opening of the file for his rook. And now, you know, this pawn was attacked once by the queen, defended once by this queen. He goes on a double attack, 2 against 1, gang attack. Pawn defends. The rook slides over, doubling of the rooks. This is very powerful. See, now the rooks can't challenge this file because it's 2 against 1 on this square. And now the rook is free to attack the queen, actually, too. So white's making these gains of mobility and activity of his pieces. See, this rook is really not doing much sitting there. Knight slides over, moving over towards the king side. Attacks the queen with the rook. Queen backs off. Now the pawn advances again to break up this defense of this pawn. Takes. Queen takes. That pawn. Bishop takes. And he takes back with the pawn, because look, if he takes with the knight, then this pawn is attacked twice and only defended once by the bishop. So he takes with the pawn. Pawn takes. Bishop takes. Knight takes. Knight takes. Now this knight slides over and attacks this undefended pawn. Queen slides back and defends. The queen slides in. Now there are two attackers. So white defends. So this is a very nice typical way that things pan out in chess. You have to go back and forth between offense and defense. And those are the critical decisions. You have to decide when you should do it, when you shouldn't. And experience and skill will develop over time. You'll make those decisions better. So the rook slides over. It's getting pretty serious over here now. White has to start thinking of defense. Black is swinging his pieces over to the king side. The knight blocks that check, simultaneously attacking that queen. Queen slides over, gets out of that. Rook slides up, frees the queen, because there's a mating square right here. Queen and knight mate, and now the queen is free to move with that rook defending that square. Pawn attacks. White better get busy here. So he wants to trade off the power piece here, and that's another typical strategy. When your opponent has a superior attack, you should, I call it attack the attack. You should try to trade off his attacking pieces, and then you can go back on your attack later. But right now, black has the superior attack, so he's got to really diffuse that. And queen takes, because queen had no escape squares, so they had to trade off. Pawn advances, and he closes off this file so this rook can't get active. Rook slides over with check, but it really doesn't do any good. Rook slides up. Yeah, he's going to try and double his rooks, maybe get some threats going, a mating threat here. In the beginner course we looked at the various mates, and basically you just try to move towards those to, maybe achieve it, or at least put your opponent on the defensive. Knight slides over, gets active, defends this pawn. Rook slides down, and now the white rook slides back for defense because he sees that this threat is building. King slides over, and now you see white actually achieved a passed pawn earlier, so he starts activating his strength now. He's going on the attack. Pawn keeps running. Knight slides over to help out, to assist that pawn. And now the rook slides over, but there's really no mate threat here now with all these defenders here. Maybe he should have slid back to try and go on the defensive himself. King over, knight slides back. Knight's made himself very active on this outpost, which we talked about earlier when we looked at the pieces. And now this is interesting. You see, this rook really doesn't have any future on this file, so he decides at least he's going to sacrifice himself for that knight and hope for the best. So he actually puts himself in line with that knight. And the rook slides up, keeping the king off of that file, that rank. Knight slides over. Now black starting to think, hey, I better get really defensive here. Now he takes the rook. Pawn takes, and that little runner is going to become a queen. Knight slides over for defense, but it's a little late. Pawn up. The knight slides over, attacking the rook, but more importantly trying to defend this queening square. But the rook slides up, and it is game over. Black resigns here because he will push the pawn, and the rook, he'll sacrifice his knight, but then it'll be two rooks against one rook, and then with good play, he should easily win. So the Giuoco piano is characterized by white trying to achieve a strong center and have more active pieces in exchange for a worse pawn structure. Black can usually try and maintain a better pawn structure and then try to attack that. And sometimes Black is successful and sometimes he is not, as we saw in this game. You may have noticed other possible moves that Black or White could have made, and that's true, and some of them were reasonable and some of them weren't. But we're only going to look at the moves that were actually played in the game. Otherwise, we'd go on forever and ever. So proceed to the next opening, which will be a variation of this Giuoco piano called the Evans Gambit.